Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into the incredible story of Enron's rise and its spectacular collapse, using the smartest guys in the room as our guide.
Yeah, it's really more than just a business story, isn't it? It's about, well, massive ambition, deregulation gone wild, some very creative accounting, and the human side of a corporate implosion.
Absolutely. And our goal here is to really pull out the key lessons, the actionable stuff for you, without getting lost in, every single detail. We want you to understand what happened and why it matters.
And the book itself, it's based on that deep reporting Fortune magazine did early on, so it's a really solid, well-researched foundation for understanding this whole saga.
So let's start somewhere maybe unexpected. Right after Enron went bankrupt, there was this very private memorial for Cliff Baxter, one of the top executives.
Hmm. His wife, Carol, kept it very quiet, shielding the family. Only about 100 people, mostly close friends and family.
And what's striking is the picture painted there. Not just the hard-charging exec, but a guy who loved sailing, music. They even found guitar picks in his wallet.
Right. Guests got a CD of his favorite songs, including Lou Reed's Perfect Day. It just immediately hits you behind the billions and the scandal. These were real people caught up in immense pressure. It really sets a human tone.
It does. Okay, so to get Enron, you first have to understand natural gas.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny now, but for ages, it was just this unwanted byproduct of drilling for oil.
Yeah, often just flared off, burned away because it was so cheap. Its value really only started climbing in the 50s and 60s.
That's when they built all those pipelines, right? Connecting the gas fields to, well, everywhere. Homes, industries.
Exactly. It became essential, but still sort of invisible, just this network humming underground.
Yeah.
And that created an opening, really, for a company like Enron.
And the man who saw that opening initially was Kenneth Lay. Came from pretty humble roots, didn't he? Rural Missouri.
Yeah, no indoor plumbing as a kid, but clearly driven. Got his
Mhm.
PhD in economics. And he made a name for himself early on, navigating this thing called the take or pay crisis.
Ah, right. Where companies had to pay for gas whether they needed it or not.
Exactly. Lay championed this idea of a spot market, letting producers sell directly to customers, just paying pipelines for transport. It was a big step towards deregulation.
And he got a lot of praise for it back then.
Oh, yeah. The local papers called him credible, bold, unique accomplishments. He was seen as a visionary, a leader pushing the industry forward. That early reputation is key.
Then came the merger that actually created Enron Houston Natural Gas, merging with Internorth up in Omaha.
And it wasn't exactly smooth sailing. There was a lot of suspicion, a power struggle.
But Lay came out on top, became CEO, then chairman. Seems like he was pretty good at the corporate politics side of things.
He definitely knew how to maneuver, quietly consolidated his power on the board. It's an early example of his style.
But there were early warning signs, too, weren't there? Like that big trading loss scandal, $85 million.
Yeah, and Lay's reaction was interesting. He basically denied responsibility, played dumb with the bankers, even though Enron was trying to raise money at the exact same time.
So the bankers felt lied to.
Oh, they were furious. One said they went apeshit. It showed this tendency Lay had, maybe to distance himself from problems, avoid confrontation. Not great for accountability.
Okay, so Lay is at the top. But two other absolutely crucial figures emerge. Richard Kinder and Jeff Skilling. Very different guys.
Totally different. Kinder was the tough one, the operations guy. Decisive. Someone said he'd take people to the woodshed. He was Lay's college buddy, interestingly.
And apparently had his own personal bankruptcy earlier on, which is kind of surprising for a guy who became so successful.
It is a reminder that paths aren't always straight. Kinder really complimented Lay, who wasn't seen as strong on confrontation.
Then you got Jeff Skilling, the ideas guy. Brilliant, Harvard MBA, pushing this concept of a meritocracy.
Right. But a meritocracy driven purely by money. His famous line, all that matters is money. You buy loyalty with money.
He'd also had a taste of the market early on. Apparently lost money as a teenager.
Yeah, like Kinder's bankruptcy, maybe a formative experience. Skilling's focus on financial incentives absolutely shape Enron's hyper-competitive, maybe even cutthroat culture later on.
Now, Skilling's initial idea for trading gas wasn't necessarily bad, was it? He saw it as a management tool.
No, initially it made sense. Using trading to manage risk, hedge prices. If you promise to deliver gas later, you can lock in a price now using financial contracts. It offered flexibility.
It sounds reasonable. Risk management.
Exactly. It wasn't just about speculation at first, but things changed.
Right. And a huge part of that change was this accounting method, mark to market. Can you break that down simply?
Okay, basically, mark-to-market allowed Enron to book the entire estimated profit from a long-term deal immediately, right up front, even if the deal spans, say, 20 years.
So they weren't booking profits as the cash came in. They were booking projected future profits now.
Precisely. Think about it. Enormous potential profits recorded instantly, but the actual cash. That might not show up for years, if ever. Their own filings use the phrase recognized but unrealized income.
Recognized but unrealized. That sounds
Yeah.
dangerous.
It is, because you can't pay bills with unrealized income. It created this massive fundamental gap between the profits Enron was reporting and the actual cash it had. That's a crucial takeaway for anyone looking at any business. Always, always look at the cash flow.
Poker profits aren't real until the cash is in the bank.
You got it. And this wasn't sustainable.
And Skilling's whole management philosophy kind of poured fuel on this fire, didn't it? This
Yeah.
intellectual meritocracy.
Yeah, at Enron Finance especially, he valued raw brain power, often over experience. Young MBAs were encouraged to run with big, risky ideas.
And if you succeeded, you got paid massively. If you failed.
You were out quickly. It was famously called the rank and yank system. Intense pressure to perform, to hit those numbers.
Which fed back into needing those mark-to-market profits to look good, I guess.
Exactly. It created this cycle. And because the cash wasn't there, Enron got more and more dependent on banks to fund its actual operations.
Even though they were reporting these huge earnings.
Right. Skilling was apparently wary of too much debt, but they needed the cash from somewhere. It just highlights how shaky the foundation was despite the shiny exterior.
Skilling himself sounds like he was incredibly intense. There's that story about him reviewing his contract while his wife was in labor.
Yeah, it's kind of legendary. He admitted later he worked like a fool, totally obsessed, couldn't switch off. It shows the kind of all-consuming culture, maybe a warning sign about balance too.
Now, let's bring in Rebecca Mark. She seems like a complete contrast in some ways.
Definitely. Her defining trait was this relentless optimism. Believed hard work could conquer anything. Her favorite book, apparently, was The Alchemist.
All about pursuing your destiny.
Right. She brought that mindset to Enron International, building these massive, complex projects overseas.
Like the Dabhol power plant in India, which turned into a bit of a nightmare, didn't it?
Oh, huge problems. Massive cost overruns, tangled agreements, accusations of bribery, endless delays. The local power board was stuck with crippling costs.
And Enron was projecting these huge returns, like 30%.
Yeah, which drew a lot of criticism. Dabhol really shows the immense risks and complexities of those big international deals, especially when maybe the due diligence wasn't quite there.
Meanwhile, back in Houston, Ken Lay seemed to be pulling back a bit.
It seems that way. He got increasingly involved in outside stuff, charities, politics, think tanks, less involved in the day-to-day grind.
Someone joked you needed to invite someone important to get Lay to actually attend an internal meeting.
Yeah. It raises questions about oversight, you know? If the CEO is becoming detached while the company is getting more complex and taking bigger risks, well, that's not ideal.
And there was that awkward situation with his son, Mark Lay.
Right. Mark worked at Enron, then got involved with another company, Bruin Interests. There were lawsuits, allegations of embezzlement involving Mark and others at Bruin.
But Enron kept doing business with a company Mark Lay was tied to. Even paid some expenses.
Yeah, it definitely raised eyebrows, potential conflicts of interest at the very least. Not a good look.
We also heard about this guy, Alexander, raising concerns about accounting at another related company, EPP.
He warned Lay, apparently, but was dismissed. Then EPP's accountants ended up effectively working for Enron through a cost-sharing deal. Alexander left.
And Enron sold a troubled asset to EPP later.
Yes, a stake in a Dominican Republic plant. It's another one of those early red flags about accounting independence and whether concerns were being properly addressed.
So even as Skilling was rising, becoming president, some analysts were getting nervous.
A few were. Downgrades started appearing, citing things like profits being boosted by one-off asset sales and the Dabhol uncertainty. The cracks were there, even if small.
But the overall hype was still strong.
Oh, yeah. The big picture narrative was still incredibly positive for a long time.
Okay, so Skilling makes this huge bet on electricity trading, sees it as massive potential.
Absolutely. He called it a no-brainer. The wholesale electricity market was, 3 times the size of natural gas? He figured deregulation was coming and Enron could dominate.
Aiming for like 20% market share, huge numbers.
Huge. And he had a McKinsey study backing him up, projecting massive growth. It was a bold, high-stakes move.
Their style really showed when they bought Portland General Electric, didn't it? Rub the arrogant regulators the wrong way.
Totally. They were apparently quite arrogant, high-handed. One regulator famously told Lay, "We don't ride around in turnip trucks here."
Huh, so they had to back down.
Yeah, they only got the deal approved after agreeing to a significant rate cut for consumers. It showed how their aggressive approach could sometimes backfire.
They also failed to buy EOG resources, right?
hmm
Because the CEO resisted the price.
Yeah, Mark Papa at EOG fought them hard and won. And Enron's reaction, they essentially blacklisted Goldman Sachs for advising EOG. Shows their competitive, maybe even punitive streak.
Inside Enron, there were tensions over pay, too, between the traders and the international folks like Rebecca Mark.
For sure. The traders in ECT resented that Mark's team got huge bonuses, even if their big projects, like Dabhol, were struggling or hadn't actually generated cash yet. They saw it as rewarding effort, not results.
But wasn't that a bit hypocritical? Weren't the traders also getting paid based on projected profits from mark to market?
Exactly. They were getting rich based on projected, unrealized gains, too. So yeah, a bit of hypocrisy there. It highlights the weird incentive structure.
And the power struggle between Skilling and Mark continued.
Oh, yes. Skilling gradually chipped away at Enron International's independence. Mark eventually stepped down as CEO of EI, though she stayed on as chairman and got this Enron vice chair title.
The ejector seat, they called it.
That was the internal nickname, yeah. It showed Stilling was consolidating power around his trading-focused vision, though weirdly he never totally cut off funding for Mark's deals.
The whole budgeting process under Skilling sounds intense. A giant game of chicken.
That's how the book describes it. Unrealistic targets, immense pressure to agree to huge growth numbers, often just pulled out of thin air, last year plus 15% kind of thing.
So if you're heading towards the end of a quarter and looking short,
You don't warn Wall Street. You do whatever it takes, desperate deals, financial engineering to hit that number. Meeting the quarterly expectation became the absolute overriding goal.
which leads to more that creative accounting, I guess.
Exactly. The lack of real cash flow forced them into ever more complex, often deceptive, internal deals just to manufacture the appearance of profit. It became a dangerous cycle.
Let's bring in Andy Fasto properly now. He becomes central to this financial engineering.
Absolutely. Fasto. Married young, him and his wife Leah both got MBAs quickly. He cut his teeth in banking, specifically in securitization at Continental Bank, right after a big scandal there at Penn Square.
Securitization that's bundling assets and selling them off.
Sort of, yeah. Creating securities backed by assets. Fasto took to it immediately. A former boss said he was like a pig in shit doing that stuff, but also noted he pushed the limits, focused on the letter of the rule, not the spirit.
And warned he could be dangerous without tight controls.
Pretty much. Said putting him in a place with aligned incentives and loose oversight could be explosive, which turned out to be quite accurate.
At Enron, Fasto wanted a piece of the action, right? A P&L profit and loss responsibility?
Yeah, that was the measure of status.
Yeah.
He lobbied Skilling and got put in charge of the new retail energy business, EES, selling power directly to homes and businesses.
But nobody really knew how to make that work?
Nope, it was ill-defined. Skilling basically told Fasto, figure it out. High risk, high reward, very Enron.
And then there's the relationship with Arthur Anderson, the auditors. It was unusually close.
Dangerously close. Anderson was deeply embedded. Shared employees, offices in the same building. They even bragged about crossing lines in a promo video for Enron.
Crossing lines. That doesn't sound like independent auditing.
Not really, no. The lead auditor, David Duncan, was young, ambitious, and close friends with Enron's chief accounting officer, Rick Causey. The lines were definitely blurred. A huge failure of independence.
So Enron initially raised money through simple stock offerings, which worked fine.
For a while, yeah. But then, needing more cash and maybe wanting less scrutiny, they shifted. Under Fasto's influence, they moved to much more complex, opaque financing methods.
This is where those infamous off-balance sheet entities come in.
Exactly. Fasto became the master of creating these special purpose entities, or SPEs, things designed to hide debt and inflate earnings.
And the disclosures around these deals varied. Some were mentioned, some vague, some secret.
Right. It was a spectrum, from innovative financing, mentioned publicly, to murky footnotes, to deals known only to a tiny circle, including Fasto himself.
Can you give an example, like White Wing?
White Wing is a classic, super complex structure involving preferred stock, debt issuance, another entity called Osprey, all designed to do one thing: keep hundreds of millions in debt off Enron's official balance sheet.
And they needed independent equity partners, but they weren't really independent.
That was often the trick. Finding ways to make the equity look independent on paper, Even if Enron effectively controlled it or guaranteed it against losses, it violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the accounting rules.
So these deals provided cash up front.
Yeah, a short-term boost. But they were like ticking time bombs. They created future obligations, often based on wildly optimistic assumptions about the assets involved. Someone called it a purported sale that looked and smelled like a financing.
Borrowing from the future.
Pretty much, until there was no future left to borrow from.
And Chuco was another one. Even worse.
Chico was notorious. The amount of supposedly independent equity was tiny, and its funding was really questionable. Involved Fasto's lieutenant, Michael Copper, using money from other shady side deals. They even did maneuvers to hide Copper's control. It was blatant manipulation.
Meanwhile, that retail business Fasto was supposed to figure out EES. How was that going?
Badly. Especially in California, where they'd hoped deregulation would create a huge market. Turns out, most people weren't that bothered about switching electricity providers, even for a discount. Sign-ups were way below expectations.
So EES was struggling, but Skilling was already looking at the next big thing, broadband.
Right. He spun off retail into EES, set up this complex phantom equity plan for himself and another exec, Lou Pai, hoping to take EES public eventually. He hired Tom White, a retired general, to run it.
And poured money into broadband, expanding offices, shuttle flights.
Oh yeah, big build-out in Portland. And then, crucially, Skilling put Ken Rice in charge of the whole broadband venture.
Rice was from the trading side, right? Do you know anything about broadband?
Nope, that was the thing. He was a Skilling loyalist, an ECT guy. Skilling seemed desperate to have one of his guys running this critical new venture.
And Rice got a sweet deal.
Unbelievably sweet. Huge salary, bonus potential, and nearly 1.8 million stock options that vested really quickly. It shows the kind of money being thrown around, especially for the inner circle.
Even before broadband really got going, there were signs of trouble in other areas, like that swap subgroup. Executives emailing about enriching themselves.
Yeah, that's a pretty damning detail. Emails outlining how restructuring SwapSub could net them millions personally. Shows a culture where personal gain was maybe becoming a major driver.
And the culture on the trading floor was changing too. Newer traders looking down on the old guard like Rice.
Apparently so. They saw Rice as out of touch, resented his past deals, even gossiped about his personal life. They had this strong belief in their own meritocracy, but it seemed pretty cliquey.
Then a new power emerged among the traders. Greg Wally.
Right. Wally. West Point grad, smart, super confident, nicknamed the union boss by some. He rose quickly, gained control of the trading floor. He was a real trader's trader.
And the board. Were they keeping an eye on the increasing risks the traders were taking?
Well, they were certainly approving bigger and bigger risk limits. Remember the early days? A $4 million loss limit. That went out the window. The board kept signing off on Wally's requests for much higher limits.
How high are we talking?
Billions in potential annual risk by the end. Way beyond what traditional financial institutions would stomach. It shows a massive shift in risk appetite and maybe a failure of board oversight.
So what was Wall Street making of all this? Were the analysts digging into these risks?
Largely no. This phenomenon called analyst capture seemed widespread. Analysts wanted access to Enron execs, wanted banking business, so they mostly just repeated the company's positive spin.
So they were captured, believing the hype or afraid to challenge it?
Probably a bit of both. One fund manager said Enron had Wall Street beaten into submission. They were seen as the smartest guys, too complex to really question.
And the credit rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, their job is literally to assess debt risk.
Yeah, that's a huge question. How did they miss the jerry-built financial structure, as the book calls it? They're supposed to focus on cash flow and ability to repay debt. It was a major failure on their part, too.
While all this financial wizardry was happening, some of the actual businesses were struggling, like that water company, Azurix.
Oh, Azurix was a disaster right from the start. They IPO'd it, but weeks later, chaos. They hadn't even secured the headquarters building in the winning bid in Buenos Aires. Billing problems, customers not paying, massive needed repairs.
They realized pretty quickly it was a dud.
Yeah, it became clear it would likely never be profitable. Another example of maybe rushing into deals without enough due diligence.
Okay, let's go back to California. The energy crisis is hitting, and Enron traders are getting creative again.
Yeah, very creative. Belden's team came up with these infamous trading strategies with names like Fat Boy, Death Star, Get Shorty, Ricochet.
Ricochet, what was that?
They called it megawatt laundering. Basically, exporting power out of California when prices were capped, then importing it back in at much higher prices when the grid was desperate, exploiting the rules.
So pure manipulation.
It certainly looked that way, designed to game the system and drive up prices during shortages.
And California officials are noticing.
Oh, they were furious. Accusations of market manipulation flew. They demanded federal investigations. FERC, the federal regulator, initially pushed back, but the political pressure grew intense.
Were people inside Enron aware this was problematic?
Yes. An Enron lawyer, Richard Sanders, flagged the California schemes internally. The outside lawyers advising the traders even wrote a memo warning about the potential legal fallout.
But the warnings were ignored.
Seems like it. The drive for profits trumped the legal or ethical concerns, apparently.
And natural gas prices were also spiking in California, adding to the crisis.
Yeah, which fueled even more suspicion that Enron might be manipulating the gas market, too, since they were such a dominant player.
The whole situation sounds chaotic. The California grid operator trying to find power.
Their COO called it a Turkish bazaar, just madness. They had price caps, so they couldn't always pay what sellers demanded, and sellers were wary of California's shaky finances. Utilities were refusing to ship power there.
Did lifting the price caps help?
Actually, no. Things got worse. Utility credit ratings plunged towards junk. Rolling blackouts became common. It was a full-blown crisis, and Enron was right in the middle of it, accused of making it worse.
Back to Fasto. He was doing deals with banks based on, trust me, equity, no real guarantees.
Yeah, there's a story about a CIBC banker doing deals like that, admitting they had an understanding with Enron that the bank wouldn't lose money just to keep the relationship going. Very risky stuff.
And that banker predicted Fasto would end up in handcuffs.
Chillingly, yes. He saw the danger even as he was doing the deals.
Meanwhile, inside Enron, someone finally looked closely at the retail division, ES.
Right. Jennifer Curry did an internal audit. What she found was staggering.
Yes.
Huge hidden trading losses, records in chaos, massive credit risks, contracts that were losing money hand over fist. Even her incomplete audit showed it was a disaster.
How did they hide that? EES was supposed to be this growth engine.
Skilling and another exec, Dave Delaney, basically buried the EES trading losses within the much larger, supposedly profitable wholesale trading operation. They consolidated the trading books.
So it looked like one big profitable pool hiding the EES disaster.
Exactly. A classic accounting trick to make EES look okay on paper. Cooking the books, basically.
And Fasto, while this is being uncovered, is hosting lavish investor meetings for his LJM funds.
Yeah, poolside in Palm Beach, very confident, surrounded by the lawyers, accountants, bankers, and investors who were benefiting from his side deals. Quite a contrast.
At the same time, Enron was struggling to sell off those underperforming international assets.
Totally. Project Summer, the plan to sell them as a package, failed. Baxter couldn't unload them individually either. And Dabhal blew up again. The Indian state stopped paying, complaining about the costs. The plant went silent.
Then came that conference call. The one with analyst Rich Grubman.
Oh, the infamous asshole call. Grubman asked a perfectly reasonable question. Why couldn't Enron provide a balance sheet or cash flow statement with its earnings release like every other company?
And Skilling's response.
Asshole. Then he hung up. Just stunned silence. Massive PR blunder. It just radiated arrogance and disdain for scrutiny.
Skilling must have known things were slipping.
He seemed to. He apparently asked analysts if he was the problem, the liability. Then he took off to Turkey for his brother's wedding while the stock was still tanking.
And people inside were getting nervous about Fasto's LJM deals, too.
Definitely. The internal concerns were growing. Fasto even pushed out his own general counsel and brought in someone new, Jordan Mintz, supposedly to get things in order.
Skilling's behavior was getting erratic, too. Downbeat one minute, hyper-optimistic the next.
Yeah, reports of wild mood swings, telling people in Portland the industry was melting down, then giving this unbelievable pep talk to the failing broadband team. People just didn't buy it anymore.
And Lou Pei, the phantom equity guy, he was selling stock.
Big time. Cashed out over $250 million in Enron's stock. More than anyone else. A huge red flag that someone high up was getting out.
Well, Ken Rice, Skilling's golden boy, was still running the broadband disaster.
Yeah, a very awkward situation. How do you deal with the failure when it's being run by the CEO's protege?
And Jim Fallon, Greg Wally's deputy, nicknamed the janitor.
Or J. Edgar Fallon. He had a reputation for being ruthless, snooping around. He was sent into broadband to clean house.
And he did.
Oh, yeah. Fired about half the staff almost immediately. Apparently confronted Skilling about who was really in charge when Rice tried to intervene. Felon won, the firings went ahead.
So Rice resigned.
Days later, yeah. He felt betrayed. Skilling reportedly told someone he was going to fire Rice anyway. Brutal.
And then came the official news. Broadband was being folded into the wholesale division. A billion-dollar failure.
Over $1 billion, yeah. Finally acknowledging the huge losses.
How were longtime Enron employees reacting to all this?
Some were deeply disturbed, seeing the culture change, seeing bright young hires turn into assholes, as one veteran put it, witnessing high fives after the broadband failure announcement. It just felt wrong, like bad karma.
There were also internal reports showing strange trading results. Big gas losses offset by sudden power gains.
Yeah, raising more questions about where those late quarter gains were really coming from. Was it market manipulation again? Desperation to make the numbers?
And the bankers, like JP Morgan Chase, were they still bullish?
Publicly, their analyst kept a buy rating, but internally, emails showed they were getting very nervous about their massive exposure to Enron. The facade was cracking.
Then the board gets this chilling presentation from Rick Bai, the risk chief.
Yeah, he laid out a disaster scenario. What happens if Enron misses earnings? Stock plunges, triggers covenants in the off-balance sheet deals. They collapse like dominoes. Credit rating gets downgraded. Margin calls hit.
Basically predicting the exact way it would unravel.
Pretty much. A cascade leading to a total loss of liquidity and confidence. He saw it coming.
But when Skilling actually resigned suddenly, how did the traders react?
Apparently, they barely blinked. Just immediately started speculating about who would replace him, who would eventually succeed Lay. Always focused on the next move.
Skilling's departure explanation caused problems, though, didn't it? Linking it to the stock price.
Yes, he told the Wall Street Journal his resignation was tied to the falling stock, which completely contradicted the official personal reasons story. Lay was reportedly furious. It just added to the chaos.
And this is when Sharon Watkins steps forward internally.
Right. Watkins, a VP who had worked for Fasto previously, had serious concerns about the accounting, especially the LJM deals. She believed the only way out was for Enron to come clean itself.
She wanted to warn Lay.
She wrote him that famous anonymous memo, then met with him. She planned to talk to Skilling, but he quit before she could. His sudden departure just convinced her something was deeply wrong.
How did Lay handle her allegations? Did he bring in independent investigators?
No, that's the crucial thing. Watkins suggested using a law firm with no prior Enron ties. Instead, Lay hired Vincent and Elkind's Enron's primary outside law firm, who had actually helped structure some of the controversial deals.
Massive conflict of interest.
Huge. Lay argued V&E knew Enron's complexities, but it looked like hiring the fox to guard the henhouse. Their eventual report largely downplayed Watkins' concerns.
And while Lay was publicly reassuring everyone, what was he doing privately?
Selling millions of dollars of his own Enron stock, secretly. He was drawing down a company line of credit and immediately selling the shares to repay it, $78 million in about a year.
While telling everyone else to hold on.
Exactly. He later claimed a personal liquidity crisis, but the family lifestyle private planes Aspen trips didn't seem to suffer. It looked terrible later.
Arthur Andersen auditors were getting worried too internally.
Yes. David Duncan warned about non-recurring charges being potentially misleading. Another partner flagged it as highly probable the SEC would investigate, and that it posed a significant danger to Andersen because of their past issues with other clients.
So they knew it was risky, but didn't blow the whistle.
It seems that way. The fear of losing the massive Enron fees likely played a huge role.
What finally forced things into the open?
Enron's desperate need for cash. They had to open their books more fully to the banks to secure loans. And that's when lenders started seeing the real picture, the problems in the core trading business that was supposed to be healthy.
Did Lay resist bringing in truly independent investigators?
Initially, yes. He apparently worried they'd just find something wrong. But with a formal SEC investigation launched, he had no choice. William Howers, a new independent director, led a special board committee investigation, and Deloitte was hired for forensic accounting.
The walls were closing in, so Lay tried a merger with Dynegy.
Yeah, he secretly met with Dynegy's CEO, Chuck Watson, pitched it as a merger of equals, hoping for a prominent role for himself in the combined company, a last-ditch effort.
Did Enron employees think Dynegy was a savior?
Not really, especially the traders. Watson seemed surprised by their attitude. Many saw Dynegy as a smaller, less sophisticated company they'd eventually dominate. That Enron swagger persisted right to the end.
But the Dynegy deal didn't stop the bleeding.
No, things got worse fast. Even after the deal was announced, trading partners refused credit. Enron online activity collapsed, European operations were failing, liquidity dried up completely.
And the Enron board's reaction to the collapse.
Pretty much denial. They claimed they'd relied on the advice of their accountants, Anderson, and lawyers, V&E, and had done their duty based on the information they were given. Little acceptance of responsibility.
After the bankruptcy filing, what happened?
Assets were sold off pipelines, power plants raising billions, actually. Settlements were reached with banks and law firms. UBS Warburg bought the core trading operation, crucially, without taking on the liabilities.
And the regulatory response.
Massive SEC enforcement actions against individuals and companies. And, of course, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002.
SOX, right. What did that do?
Big changes. CEOs and CFOs now have to personally certify financial statements. Much stricter rules for auditors, independence, internal controls, corporate governance, designed specifically to prevent another Enron.
What about Fasto? Did he fight the charges?
Initially, he tried to blame Skilling and others, portraying himself as just the finance guy raising needed capital under their direction.
But he eventually pleaded guilty.
Yes, in a pretty dramatic deal. His wife, Leah, was also charged. They reached a package deal. She pleaded guilty to a tax charge for a short sentence, and Andy pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud. Agreed to a 10-year sentence, later reduced for cooperation, forfeited millions, and became a key government witness.
Admitting he cut the books.
Admitting he and others manipulated Enron's results, yes. His cooperation was huge for the government's case against Lay and Skilling.
Ken Rice also pleaded guilty.
Yeah, Rice pleaded guilty to securities fraud related to lying about the broadband business. He also cooperated, paid fines, forfeited assets. The trials of other broadband execs had mixed results, though.
And the main event. The trial of Lay and Skilling.
A long trial, 2 months of testimony. The government methodically built its case. Lay came across as gracious, Skilling more snarly and combative.
And the verdict?
Guilty, both convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. A landmark verdict holding top executives responsible.
How did Lay react?
He was apparently shocked, maintained his innocence, talked about his family and faith, but then, just 41 days later, he died suddenly of a massive heart attack while vacationing in Aspen.
Wow. Before he could be sentenced.
Exactly. An autopsy revealed he had severe, previously undisclosed heart disease, a really dramatic end to his story.
Okay, it's an incredible, complex story. Let's distill this down. What are the big takeaways for listeners? What can you do with this knowledge?
Right, actionable insights. First, and maybe most importantly, be incredibly skeptical of anything that seems overly complex financially. Enron's maze of SBEs hid the truth. If you can't understand how a business or investment works, that's a huge red flag. Demand transparency.
Good point. If it seems too complex, it might be designed that way. What else?
Second, recognize the danger signs of unchecked ambition and a win-at-all-costs culture. The pressure cooker environment at Enron warped ethical judgment. In your own work, in any organization, pay attention to the culture. Does it prioritize ethics or just results? Speak up if things feel wrong.
That pressure to meet numbers is powerful. Third takeaway.
Independent oversight is absolutely critical. The failure of Enron's board, its auditors, even its lawyers to provide real scrutiny was catastrophic. Always seek independent perspectives, whether it's for investments, business decisions, or even personal advice. Don't rely solely on those with a vested interest.
Makes sense. Fourth.
Always distinguish between paper profits and actual cash flow. Mark-to-market became a tool for deception at Enron. Reported earnings looked great, but the cash wasn't coming in. Whether you're looking at a company or your own finances, cash is king. Understand where the actual money is coming from and going to.
Right. You can't spend unrealized gains. Fifth point.
Remember the human element. Personalities, motivations, ethics, or lack thereof of people like Lay, Skilling, Fasto, Watkins, they drove the story. Character matters in leadership and in partnerships. Individual choices have massive consequences, even in huge organizations.
Definitely.
And finally,
deregulation needs careful thought and strong safeguards. Enron saw deregulation as pure opportunity, but the California crisis showed the potential for manipulation and abuse without proper oversight. Understand that deregulation has potential downsides as well as benefits. We need smart rules, not necessarily no rules.
those are really solid takeaways. So maybe final thought to leave people with.
Yeah, Enron is just this stark reminder, isn't it, that even the most admired, innovative companies can be built on sand. We still live in a world of complex finance, intense pressure for growth. So the question for all of us is, what safeguards, what individual ethical commitments do we need now To make sure history doesn't repeat itself on that scale, how do we uphold integrity within organizations? That's something worth thinking about.